Hi, I'm Derek Wilson, Executive Director of Southern AIDS Coalition, and welcome to this afternoon's conversation around a pre-HIV testing day conversation around the impact of HIV and the Black community in the United States, particularly with a focus on the South. I'm so happy to have with me a number of luminaries in the field of HIV prevention and treatment that are really here today to engage and have a really in-depth conversation as to how we move forward, not just where we are, but how we move forward to where we need to be to end the HIV epidemic. Of course, in these days and times, we can't have a conversation about health and any pandemic without also considering the impact of COVID-19, particularly as it relates to African-American communities. Because again, just as with HIV, we find that COVID is disproportionately impacting African-Americans and in many ways, the exact same communities that are at risk for HIV transmission are also being impacted by HIV. So I'm really glad that you're able to be here with us today to join in this conversation. We do have a function where you can just put your comments in. If you put your comments in, we'll be able to address any questions that you may have. But ultimately, we want this to be a family conversation. This should not just be a group of us or a group of experts who are coming together to out-expert each other. It's really an opportunity for us as a community to really come together and figure out how we can solve our own problems. There is no knight in shining armor that's going to come to our rescue. As usual, we as Black people have to figure out how to save ourselves, how to be our own knights in shining armor. And so I thank again our panelists today, and I would like to introduce our panel. We have Dr. Pranessa Seal, who is the CEO of the Balm and Gilead. I have Benton Hill-Jones, who is the Executive Director of the Southern Black Policy and Advocacy Network. I have Ian Haddock, who's with the Normal Anomaly Initiative. And finally, we have Shiloh Fields, who's with Jefferson County, Alabama Department of Health, and she's the HIV manager there. And so I'll just turn the microphone over to them, beginning with Dr. Seal, to introduce themselves, introduce a little bit about what their organization does.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be with you today. The Balm and Gilead, we are now in our 32nd year. My Lord have mercy. 32nd year of mobilizing and building the faith community to address health disparities. And as many of you know, we started out with HIV in 1989, calling on the faith community of Harlem to begin to address HIV. And then, of course, we branched out nationally, and then we branched out internationally. And in 2005, today, not only are we addressing HIV, but also Alzheimer's, COVID-19, brain health, diabetes, just the array of alarming rates of health disparities in our community. And we believe for these 32 years and beyond that the most influential institution in our community is our faith community. And they must be at the forefront of addressing all of our health problems. And that's what we've been doing for 32 years. And I'm happy to be with you today.
Great. Thank you so much. Talk a little bit about National HIV Testing Day and what it means to you, Dr. Seal, as well as some things that the Balm and Gilead has been features for either currently or past National HIV Testing Day.
Well, you know, I have bittersweet thoughts when it comes to National HIV Testing Day. Because of the silence, 30 years, 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, there are big banners all the way. I'm sure many of you might remember silence is death when it comes to HIV. And today that silence, I mean, the HIV is just not a conversation in our community, even when we compare it to where it was in the 80s and 90s. So that's my bitterness part of it. When I look back, the Balm and Gilead, we were in the forefront of bringing HIV testing to the African American community in I believe it was 1999, 2000, when the CDC rolled out HIV testing. We rolled out with the campaign "Our Faith Lights the Way," and it was a campaign of we did a video, we call it video, but then it was television, totally television, based in St. Philip's Episcopal Church, of the role of faith communities being that anchor of HIV testing. And from that rollout, we began to see churches began to do more testing than health departments. And I can lift up churches like Beautiful Gate, Bethel AME Church in Delaware, and Shiloh over in Ohio, and just around the country, where CDC began to see that when the church began to have HIV testing sites, they saw the numbers of people would come back and get their results. Because if you remember, we were doing testing, people would come get testing, but wouldn't come back and get their results. So the faith community was a major learning curve. We got a lot of best practices on not only how to test, but also how to provide support that would engage people to make them come back to get the results, and to engage them to keep them into treatment. So the faith community really played a major role in rolling out the entire HIV testing campaign throughout the country. And I think that, so that's the sweet part of it. But the bitter part of it, having been in this conversation for 32 years, is that look at where we are now. Have we regressed in our conversation around HIV as a whole, and particularly around HIV testing?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And we're going to dig into that a little bit more as we get into our conversation. Vinton, come on, introduce yourself.
All right. Thank you so much, Derek. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vinton Hill-Jones, and I'm the founder and chief executive officer of the Southern Black Policy and Advocacy Network. And the Southern Black Policy and Advocacy Network was founded in 2018, and we have the mission of improving health outcomes and reducing social and economic disparities impacting Black communities in the South. And our work focuses on what we call a team approach: training, education, advocacy, and mobilization. Our work, really, when we look at the conversation about the South, I think there are some key issues that are still very important now. One, Black community leaders, particularly those who are working in public health spaces, must be mobilized and engaged in order to end the HIV epidemic. Another thing, communities have to be able to understand policy and advocacy issues and how they impact the Black community. And another area, we really have to make sure that we're creating solutions that speaks to the needs of diverse Black communities versus an ongoing tokenism that we sometimes see in public health and other spaces. So our work is focused on that in the South and doing that work. One area that we've been able to accomplish since our launch is the creation of the Southern Black HIV/AIDS Network and the HIV/AIDS Network Advisory Council, which are made of HIV leaders throughout the South. We've also been able to release our HIV advocacy assessment, which we can talk a little bit about later, that has focus on the end of the epidemic plan and strategies for engaging Black communities. And a piece that we're working on this year is really around voter engagement and education. How do we make sure that those who are working in public health policy and advocacy understand the implications of our elections that we have coming up, and how to make sure to be educated about the issues that those who are running for office are engaged in, and also create an opportunity for those who are seeking office and seeking the vote of Black communities, how to make sure that they're aware and educated about the needs of Black communities as they continue to lead and shape policy. So we're very excited to be here in this conversation, and I'll turn it back over to Derek.
So talk a little bit then, Vinton, about National HIV Testing Day from your context. Like, what does it mean to you, and what do you think is the state of HIV testing across the South?
Well, HIV testing, National HIV AIDS Testing Day is, of course, one of the most visible awareness days that focuses on HIV testing, and I think it's wonderful. But how do we make sure that we're not just putting emphasis on Black communities during National Black HIV/AIDS Awareness Day? How do we make sure to continue to highlight the needs of diverse populations of Black communities within these conversations? Because I feel right now that we've done very well in creating the HIV infrastructure, but how do we now take, especially now with the reality of COVID and just the continued reality of how health disparities impact Black communities, how do we tie HIV testing strategies into those everyday strategies that really connect these conversations from policymakers and researchers to someone's living room, and make sure that those conversations are relevant, so that in this time of COVID, how are we talking about strategies for those individuals to get tested for COVID and HIV, or even hypertension, really creating this space of wellness, and as we move forward, how to continue engaging in work that really pushes that conversation, in addition to the existing conversations around HIV testing, because it's very important that we get tested for HIV, but until we start really dealing with issues around stigma, discrimination, racism, it's definitely prevalent in the South, as we're seeing that, play out now in a number of different issues. We're not going to see the end of HIV. So the day is important, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Cool, great. Thank you very much, Ben. I appreciate it. Next up, we have Ian Haddock from the Normal Anomaly Initiative. That's intentionally a tongue twister, and I'm sure I will fail it many other times since. But Ian, tell us a little bit about what you do.
Hi, Derek, and thank you so much for introducing me. My name is Ian L. Haddock. I am the founder and executive director of the Normal Anomaly Initiative, which is a digital storytelling organization that has a social justice and racial justice lens. And we use that to dismantle the systems of oppression and the structures that keep us at the height of disparities. And so I'm really, really excited to be a part of this conversation, because I represent the people who are often overlooked in these conversations. And those are the people that are most at the margins, the people who don't have a connection to public health, the people who don't have really good conversations around sex and sexuality, and really don't have comfort in that. And so I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation, because those people really need our activism and our advocacy. They really need a spotlight put on them. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here.
I'm unmuting. So talk to me about National HIV Testing Day from your perspective. What do you think are some opportunities and challenges for National HIV Testing Day 2020, particularly as it relates to the Black community?
Absolutely. So when I think about this conversation, I think about when I was doing frontline work for organizations, and I was actually doing testing at the beginning of my career. And I call this person 26, because 26 was a really important person that tested positive at my organization, in which I left afterwards, because 26 came in and he was in such a bad place, and the only space that he had to be himself was our Vogue classes. And so he would come and he would Vogue in our drop-in center. And at this time, we were doing an initiative where we were doing testing for tickets. And so we tested this young man, and he came back reactive. And I remember saying, like, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that this young man lives and, gets undetectable and all this kind of stuff. And about 4.5 weeks later, they found him overdosed, and we were going to his funeral. And it was so impactful, because I began to say, wait, we're doing these things for these testing days. We're coming into these spaces to mobilize communities around conversations around sex and sexuality. But there are a myriad of other issues and disparities and structures and oppressive beings that we see that we can't touch in the testing room. And so that's why I started this organization. I started this organization because those stories need to be told. Those stories need to be in the forefront. Those stories are what's going to dismantle the systems of oppression in which we sit in. And so I stand very encouraged today in 2020 as I listen to all of the wonderful work that has been done before me, all of the wonderful people that are on this panel. I am encouraged because those stories are finally being told. We are finally in a space where social justice and racial justice has recognized that HIV is not a public health issue. It sits at the margins of social and racial justice. And as we look at it through that lens, and as we begin to create policies and advocacies and goals towards that lens, we actually move several different spaces forward. And so I'm encouraged today on and the days to come as we celebrate National HIV Testing Day, because now those systems are beginning to be broken down. Whereas I would have to go in, I'm on PrEP. And so when I would go in and get PrEP, it was such a tedious process to get on PrEP. And I started to ask myself, I mean, I'm already quote unquote risky. Now I got to come here every 11 weeks and then come back another week. But now those systems are starting to recognize that that's a problem. And now I just go see my pharmacy, get my test, do my labs, and I'm out of there. So because we are seeing this as a social and racial justice issue now, we are starting to move the mantle forward, and I'm encouraged today.
Cool. I feel like I should take up an offering right now. That was you took us to church there, Ian. Pernessa, I got a witness here. And next, finally, we have Shiloh Fields. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the work you do for the Department of Health in Alabama?
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. Again, I'm Shiloh Fields. I have the pleasure of working in a dual role. I work as an HIV manager for Jefferson County, connected with ADPH, where I am connected with some wonderful AIDS service organizations throughout Jefferson County and Birmingham, and we simply come together to have collected conversations about prevention, education, and testing, and what that looks like or should look like throughout Jefferson County and Birmingham. My primary role is also post-test counseling linkage to medical care at the UAB 1917 clinic. So I get a chance to do both prevention and education, as well as the entire linkage process. And so it's kind of the best of both worlds, where you're in the community as well as being able to counsel, comfort, and let those who have been newly diagnosed know that they can live an outstanding life after being diagnosed.
So what are some things that are happening in Jefferson County that you want to lift up around HIV testing day? I mean, I know in a COVID world, it's kind of hard to do activities. So how do you adjust as a local health department? How do you adjust in terms of how do you do HIV testing? How do you get it out in the community when HIV testing calls people to be in a very close space? But but our COVID protocols say that you need to social distance. So how is Jefferson County really kind of tackling HIV testing?
I will say, by working at the 1917 clinic, there was a pause on HIV testing because of the social distancing. But I will say that the AIDS service organizations continued to do testing, and they just found very innovative ways to do it. Because they knew the importance of people continue to be tested, and I applaud them every day. And they've also come up with some wonderful, innovative, and entertaining ways to continue to push education. Even if you can't get into a crowded setting, if you can't go to a party or a testing event, there are still innovative ways to do testing. One of the things that ADPH is, the Alabama Department of Public Health, has supported and has sent information out, has to do with self-testing, which is an organization can support individuals with, if they want to do an HIV test at home, instead of going out to purchase it, they can possibly get it from free at an ASO or a clinic. So there are a couple of great ways where people can get tested and get tested in a safe way and still confidential, but also get linked to care if they're positive.
Great. Thank you so much. And I know that my staff is going to scream at me because I've let y'all introduce yourselves and your organizations. I've said nothing about mine. So please forgive me. Southern AIDS Coalition, in our heart and soul, we are a social justice organization whose particular lens in social justice is health justice. And our focus in health justice is ending the HIV epidemic, as well as other disparities in terms of how they impact those who live in the South. We do this work through a couple of different ways. We do it through intersectional advocacy, through bringing people together from throughout the South, organizations from throughout the South, leaders from throughout the South, leaders from health departments and corporations and CBOs and clinical settings. We bring them together so that we might be able to network with each other and also strengthen each other through just shared advocacy around issues that impact us as those who live in the South. We do this also through some strategic grant making, making sure that we support grassroots organizations throughout the South in sponsorship with Gilead Corporation. We are a Compass Center for Gilead, and we're doing grant making for organizations throughout the South, mostly grassroots organizations, to help them sharpen their voices, to lift their voices, and to define their voices in the public sphere. Also supporting them in terms of how they build their structure and their infrastructure so they can be strong and resilient organizations. We also do this through just really a lot of training around stigma and the impacts of stigma and how stigma impacts care delivery, how stigma impacts people being able to engage in prevention services. And so the Southern AIDS Coalition really seeks to be a common ground for all those throughout the South who are really invested in doing something substantive about HIV, to come together, to network, and to make sure that the Southern voice is heard. I just think it's an interesting, it's an interesting bit of serendipity that everyone here is pretty much living in the South, and this is important not because we're the Southern AIDS Coalition, but because of the fact that the South represents the place with the highest rate of new transmissions. The South represents the highest rate of persons who are living with HIV. And so we really have to pay attention to the South right now, because when it comes to HIV in particular, it is the South that is the place where all of this action is happening. And if I were to take a quick, pivot, I asked each of you about what HIV Testing Day means to you. I'll talk for a quick second about what it means to me. I have this ring right here. This is the ring that I gave to my partner. My partner, Derek, died in 2001. And I lift this up in terms of HIV Testing Day because at the time that we were together, we were together for 6 years. At the time we were together, I was actually running an HIV testing program, but he and I never talked about HIV testing because it was just an assumption that you're gonna handle your business, I'll handle mine. It was this code of silence that is so often in African-American communities of you just take care of your stuff and I'll take care of mine. So I just assumed that since he was in Howard University and in dental school and doing all these things and getting his degrees, I just assumed I'm not going to bring it up. It'd be impolite. He's handling his business, and he never asked me if I was getting tested either. And unfortunately, he never got tested until he got diagnosed with AIDS, and he got ill, and he died within a year or so of being diagnosed with HIV. And so HIV Testing Day to me represents this. This is what it means to me. It's very personal to me because it really speaks to a dynamic we have in Black communities where we just don't talk about stuff because it's just impolite or uncomfortable. And so it's the importance of having the conversation. And so now I'm very intentional with all of my friends. I annoy them about everything. Are you getting tested? Are you doing this? Because I've learned, I've lost someone who meant the world to me because we didn't have that conversation. And so that's what HIV testing means to me. Getting to, back to the point about HIV and the South, it's interesting because we have another pandemic that's taking place. HIV is a pandemic, and we have another pandemic that's taking place right now, and that's COVID-19. most people are talking about COVID-19, and there's such a furor about COVID-19 that people have almost forgotten that HIV is even existing anymore, as if we can't have two pandemics taking place at the same time. And so the interesting pattern for me is that HIV, in many ways, the pattern was it broke out in San Francisco and New York City. And those were the epicenters. And then slowly over time, they kind of did some things and got themselves together and organized and fought and struggled. And now the South has become really the epicenter of HIV. COVID seems to be doing a similar thing. It started in California, started in New York. And now when we look at the maps of places that are the highest and hottest, it's the South. And so my question for anyone who wants to start, I'll start with you, Shiloh. I want to say Dr. Fields. I'll start with you, Shiloh, and ask, what are you seeing in terms of the parallels between COVID-19 and HIV, and has concern for one supplanted the other?
I think one of the parallels would be the miseducation between HIV and COVID. In HIV, there wasn't any data collected in the beginning. So not alone were we to assume that this was just targeting one particular type of person, there wasn't anything that was collected to show that it was attacking everyone and anyone who is sexually active. I think it's the same thing with COVID. The ongoing joke on, I don't know about you all's time feed, but mine was that Black people can't catch COVID. And it literally, someone had to become diagnosed in order for that to be a fib. And so just the education of it all and the lack of testing and the lack of data that is there, I think is truly parallel.
Well, yeah, because because we used to say back in the 80s, I mean, not that I remember the 80s, I was far too young. But but there were people saying in the 80s, HIV is for them gay white boys. It's not our problem. Dr. Seal, could you talk a little bit about the historic, the samenesses?
Me on mute. Yes, HIV, it was a gay white disease. And it was not going to affect women. It was a homosexual disease. And we always, when these pandemics, it's always those people, and I remember I was in a church in somewhere in South Carolina when COVID, the conversation around COVID began. And I stood there and said, please do not believe this thing about this is not going to hit Black people. You can trust me that it's going to hit us. And when it hit us, it's going to hit us hard, because it always does. But whenever you see a wave of new health issues coming in, we the Black people, we always just say, hallelujah, thank you, Jesus, it's not us this time. And then we wake up and say, uh-oh, it is us this time. What did we do wrong? So we sing hallelujah in the beginning, it's not us. And then we go to what did we do wrong? And that's when stigma rolls in, and we begin to blame each other within our circle. So unfortunately, here we are again, where we are looking at, it's us again. But I also want to, jump in and say, something around HIV and COVID. And I think that because we're in the midst of COVID, it lends itself for us to have conversations and to educate people. Because the reality is that we have a generation of Black folks who don't know nothing about HIV and AIDS. If we're not constantly talking about it. There are no billboards, now I'm in Richmond, Virginia, having been here for 14 years, spent most of my time in New York. And I don't know how things are in Brooklyn today, but you don't find no billboards in Richmond talking about HIV or HIV testing. HIV has really become silo. It's really, the conversation, happens within, the transgender community, the homosexual community, you know what I mean? But if you're not a part of that community, then the conversation is kind of mute. So what we have found at the Balm and Gilead, how we continue to keep the conversation going, is that we've been able to educate people who probably would not hear your message, Ian, or your message, Derek, through talking about COVID. You know what I mean? About talking to elders who need to know about HIV. Did you go get tested? You know what I mean? Or just to educate you on the virus. What is a virus? How does COVID virus differ from HIV virus? And that's very basic for us. But for thousands of people that we have said this message to, they had never heard it. A matter of fact, the question that came from the church to me was, what is a virus? And it hit me like boom, because it was such a basic question, but for me, but here I had thousands of people asking me, what is a virus? And just that simple question for me, Miss Immunologist, was like, oh my God, here again, we are talking to a generation of folk who don't know, and an older generation who really still have not heard. So COVID allows us to have a conversation to reach people who we probably never reached in our communities that we're focused on.
Yeah, completely.
Can I add something there? Yo, sorry. So I'm also wearing another hat. I was, brought in to speak after David Johns from the National Black Justice Coalition could not be here to be a part of this conversation. The reason I brought up NBJC is prior to working with the Southern Black Policy and Advocacy Network, I worked with NBJC, where we really, during my time there, and really the history of the organization was really focused on changing the narrative for the Black community to understand that the Black LGBT people are a part of the Black family. And what I see sometimes in these conversations, and as Dr. Seal talks about, the faith community, and just really the dialogue that's going on in the Black community, is that we put LGBT here and we put, Black here. And how do we start talking about and advocating for the Black lives that are a part of that narrative, and understand how that's intentionally being taken out of those, those conversations, both on the LGBT side, the side of the story about HIV and who it really impacts, and this conversation moving forward about not necessarily just me as a Black gay man or someone from the transgender community or a cisgender woman. It's really about how do we talk about ourselves in this Black family context, in the context of you're talking about somebody's brother, sister, mother, cousin, somebody in that, and they have to be a part of that story. And the church really plays an integral role, because I remember just in my own life growing up how church was on Sunday, Bible study was on Wednesday, on Saturday was choir rehearsal, and and everything else that happened even after church, moving on into different social services that we would have after that. And so I think that I'm very interested in having this conversation about the Black family, and how do we incorporate more conversations in the Black family about Black health and keeping our community healthy, and how do we use each of our different avenues to have that conversation. Because as Dr. Seal said, anything that's going to come through this community from a health perspective will hit Black communities harder, because a number of other social and economic issues that I know we're all going to talk about continue talking about on this conversation. So thank you so much for those points that were raised.
And I want to piggyback on you, and thank you so much for that. For the Balm and Gilead, everything that we are talking about, we talk about an inclusive conversation.
Mm-hmm,
so, I'm having a conversation, and just sharing with us some of the challenges we have in our silos. But for Balm and Gilead, we are always talking about, I'm always lifting it up, putting it up. My gay brothers and sisters, my transgender brothers and sisters, and really, because I come from the perspective that there is no family that has not has a family member. You know what I mean? Family members. And we have to talk not from the place of what is, and an assumption that you love somebody. And I mean, having been in this work and this conversation for 32 years, believe it or not, we have moved, and we have moved to a place where some of us are not having the conversation because we still think that we're stuck. You know, but the needle really has moved in the Black community. For everybody, not for everybody, but for a lot of churches, for a lot of pastors, for a lot of faith-based people, the needle has truly moved. But people are not standing up and saying, yeah, let me tell you about my transgender daughter. No, they're not saying that, but their heart is in the right place. And I just need to say that the needle really has moved from, and I got some whelps on my back from pushing that needle as well. So I needed to say that as well because I'm hurt.
Yeah. I definitely feel that, because it goes back to what I said earlier in my comments about this conspiracy of silence that we created. I pastored for many years in Philadelphia, and I was very clear in terms of our theology that we don't have breakdowns based on sexuality or gender issues. And I would have my colleagues who, if you know the scripture, there's a young man named Nicodemus who kind of snuck to Jesus at night because he didn't want his friends to see him coming to Jesus. And I had a whole lot of my fellow pastors who would say, you know what, Wilson, you're right. You're right, and you're preaching right, and you're teaching right, but I ain't gonna do that. I ain't gonna touch that because they're afraid that their check might be affected by that. And so we do have to have these conversations where we move beyond the conspiracies of silence to be able to really have full conversations about all Black lives matter, and the fact that we are all a part of the same community. And I want to bring Ian in to the conversation now, because the question I have, particularly as it relates to COVID, because COVID says social distancing and we should stay away from each other and stay 6 feet apart. So does that mean that hooking up has come to an end and that people ain't hooking up no more because of COVID? How does that work?
So I always like to look at it from this particular lens. So you have a community who uses the club, drugs, and socialization. I know this is a generalization, but you have a community of people who uses these things to cope, right? And then you say, let me take all of that away and then don't hook up, right? We've never had conversations around like, what does mental health look like when we talk about wholeness, right? What does finding a therapist? A therapist, I mean, we were taught very early that therapy meant you were crazy, right? So we've never talked about like good coping techniques. And now we're saying, don't hook up. Hooking up is most definitely happening. I would argue from the circles that I've talked to and the focus groups that we've even had around COVID and HIV, what people are saying is that that's the only way they can cope at this point. Hooking up is the only way they can cope. And then for the predominance of the community, they are now at the leisure of working from home if they have jobs, right? And so the people that were already at home who were either couch surfing or homeless, now they are looking for things to do with people now that are at home, right? So hooking up is definitely happening. And I just want to lift up that if you do have privilege, I have this right here. If you do have the privilege, I know that it's hard to get testing done. It's hard to go to a testing facility. If you have the privilege of having a couple dollars, they do have at-home tests in the Walgreens, at least here. And so if you are concerned about the fact that you are hooking up more often than not, and you are coping, and you don't know your status, or you have a presumed negative status, you can go get an at-home test such that you can update your status yourself. And the reason why this is important is because we're at the intersection of, as we talked about, several pandemics. We talked about HIV. We also talked about COVID-19. But what we haven't talked about is that either I can die from not being able to breathe, or I can die with the police's knee on my neck. Right. So we're also in between all of that, too. So we're having to fight multiple things. And so if we can reduce the effects of HIV by knowing your status, getting on PrEP. There's Hey Mister. There's many different avenues that you can still get on PrEP. And so if we can take care of this, we can also look into all of the other intersections of justice that must be had a conversation about, because we're not going to stop hooking up.
Right. And I just also want to acknowledge Kwame Cherry put in comments. I heard someone put it this way: we cannot afford to divorce ourselves from each other as Black folk when it comes to the issues that we face. We also have Javon, who agreed with you that people are surely hooking up. It reminds me of one of my mentors is Reverend Ed Sanders from Tennessee. And one of the things that he always talks about is the fact that at the end of the day, we are sexual beings. No matter how saved and sanctified we are, no matter how we devote ourselves to the Orisha, no matter how many times we pray heading towards Mecca, we are still sexual beings, and that's not a bad thing. It's not a shameful thing. Our sex and our sexuality is a gift given to us from the divine. It's just learning how to do it. And so very often when it comes to, especially when it comes to stigma, because if you think about COVID, and then you throw on top of it all of the racism and other things that are happening right now, people will cope. And sexual expression is often a way that people will cope with the issues that they're dealing with. And so I want to march back down to Texas to talk with Minton for a second and ask, because it was touched on a little earlier, Ian touched on it, what do you think is the interplay between this current level of activism we're seeing around police brutality and racism and race and pulling down Southern statues, Confederate statues? What's the interplay between that and stigma and HIV? How does that all work? Are they connected? And if so, how do you think they're connected?
Absolutely. And so I really appreciate you raising that point, because so often when we look at social media, we look at the news, we try to make this about an individual incident or some kind of individual engagement, when this is really just the ongoing history around the fight for Black lives in this country. So whether we talk about that in the public health space, we talk about that in the safety space, we talk about policymakers, it's really about how are we defending Black lives, and just the exhaustion around seeing people that look like you being murdered for I wouldn't say for no reason, but when you see the contrast of the same activities happening because of a football game or a hockey game, and when people are marching in the streets, it's about the loss of life that we continue to see and the value that society is placing on Black bodies, and people are tired of seeing that. And so when we talk about the HIV epidemic, the exact same thing. And so when we talk about making this connection, we really have to understand that they are very much so directly connected. And the bigger conversation in advocacy is, how do we elevate conversations around public health to that level, to make sure that we understand that just like with police violence, we are experiencing loss of life at an exponential rate of Black communities as it relates to a number of different health conditions, HIV, COVID, heart disease, all those different things. And so that's a huge connection, an opportunity that we have to really have a conversation about restoring or putting in place a space of wellness for Black communities, because what's clear is that every time there's been advancement for Black people, there's always been a violent swing to the other direction, starting with Reconstruction, where we had the most amount of Black elected officials in the history of this country. And that has not happened before. We continue to move forward to the civil rights era, when we, talking about, Jim Crow laws and our leaders being killed. We talk about the drugs that were put into our communities and our leaders being killed. We talk about the election of a Black president, and all of these different issues tying together, and just these violent swings of conversations that continue to show that there is not an equitable value on Black lives, and that has to change. And people are tired of seeing that, and also from a generational standpoint, you now have a new generation of Black people who are seeing that with their own eyes. You now have conversations to where I was younger, but I remember back in the 90s and early 2000s to where people would literally try to make me feel crazy and say, I don't know why you're so sensitive to race, because slavery was X amount of years ago. And it's like, it's not about that. It's still these things that I still experience each and every day. And how now, not only am I petrified around, COVID-19, I have to also keep in my mind the number of other ways that as a Black man that I could be murdered or I could lose my life when I walk outside of my door. And that is a feeling that I think we haven't really talked as much about, is the trauma that Black communities are experiencing right here in this moment, and having to deal with COVID, but are still expected to get out into the streets because we have to defend our lives. And that's a very important conversation. I also want to just briefly mention, to a point that you made, Derek, about the need for more healthy dialogue around sex and sexuality. We can have sex, but we still haven't gotten to that place to where we can really break down, not only in larger social spaces, but also in our own bedrooms, the negotiations around how pleasure will be experienced by someone, and how do we continue to move that conversation in Black spaces and in society, especially when you also attach that to the conservativeness that exists within the South and those political structures that also perpetuate us not having these healthy conversations, and also continues to further perpetuate stigma that exists between COVID and HIV and all those different issues. And so it's ultimately about moving the conversation to a place of wellness, and how do we really address this entire environment that plays a role in that. So
yeah, I think that's really key. And it really kind of, well, first, I do want to shout out a couple of people. Ronald Matters, thank you so much. One of my favorite bloggers, Ronald Matters, good to see you watching. And JT Williams, thank you for your comments. Of course, they are hooking up, and we are testing more, even our extended hours for testing. And I would love, JT, if you could talk a little bit about that, or type a little bit about what you're doing, and I'll make sure I read it back. And Darian Bannister, also good to see you as well. But one of the things, Benton, as you were talking about and highlighting, is issues of stigma. And I know for me, something that has been very overwhelming to me lately as a stigma issue is the number of trans people, trans women in particular, who are being killed. This is no exaggeration. I think in the past 4 weeks, there have been 5 Black trans women who have been killed. One of them, in the city that I used to live in Philadelphia, was found dismembered and thrown into a river. And so how do we grapple with this question? Since this is a family conversation, how do we grapple with this question of difference and overcoming difference, understanding that every life has value? Because we'll never be able to solve the HIV issue until we solve the issue of every life having value, whether I agree with that, the way that they're conducting that life or not. Every life has value. So I'll throw this open to whoever wants to jump in. Shiloh, I see you unmuting, so come on.
Yeah, so we always, as professionals, we like to pass the word stigma along because we understand what it means. But when you get into the community, like, nobody is talking about the word stigma. What they are talking about is shame, fear, and hate, which of course all combines in what stigma can comprise of. But that's when you get into the differences between who we are, people. If I'm fearful or ashamed to say who it is that I love or what I love to do, or just the simple fact of having a conversation with my partner, whomever they may be, in the bedroom, that turns inward. And sad to say that violence can turn outward, dealing with shame and fear. And so we have to be able to have this open conversation. One, be truthful with who we are, who we love, what we love about ourselves. But violence against people, all Black people, but particularly with transgender women, it is just, for me, it is all about fear and this unbeknownst shame when there shouldn't be at all. Right. There should not be at all. And until we attack loving us, Black people loving us, no matter what we decide to call ourselves, no matter who we decide that our names are, no matter how we present, then we will not get outside of the hate and the fear. And it's sad. And a lot of times, we talk about going outside and being fearful of someone coming against us. But in essence, we don't have the conversations of us going against one another. Because sad to say, a lot of those women who were killed, has anybody talked about the demographic of people that they were dealing with? And 9 times out of 10 is going to be somebody who looks just like us. And there's some form of someone told whomever they love, or whatever person that they are enjoying and are loving and are appreciating, that's wrong. And that's a conversation that needs to be delved into. But that's deep in comparison to just a simple conversation of what sex is and how you enjoy sex and who you enjoy sex with.
Right. I want to read a couple of comments, and then I want to go to Dr. Seal. Javon wrote, historically, racist propaganda labeled Black people as sex fiends and beasts, that they are closer to animals than people. I do not think those effects are generational, and that on top of unspoken sexual violence, learned and internalized shame, and now finger wagging, COVID has me worried. The Brothers in Conversation Initiative wrote in, we do 2 exercises with our men. First, a lens activity that allows them to see how their identities and intersections affect their biases and prejudice. And then a stigma tree activity that shows how those biases and prejudices manifest. And I just also want to give a shout out. Brothers in Conversation Initiative is just a phenomenal organization that is doing phenomenal work in Florida. And so thank you for tuning in. And so the question I have for Dr. Seal is, when we're discussing issues of stigma, and I'm not one of those people that's going to blame the Black church for every problem.
Thank you.
I'm really not, because at the end of the day, the Black church, I'm a product of the Black church. It made me, it honed me, it shaped me. I love it. I defend it. I love it enough to tell the truth to it about itself. And so I'm wondering, based upon your comments earlier, Dr. Seal, how has conversations around stigma, because you noted that there has been a shift in the 32 years of your work, that you've been really able to see a shift and change. How has the conversation around stigma evolved? Because there are many people who don't even go to church, but will use church as justification for their stigmatizing language and stigmatizing actions. And so I'm wondering, how do we engage faith leaders? How has the conversation changed? And what do you think is the work that is still left to do? We still have, for example, some great examples. We have in New York City, we have oh shoot, I forget, I'm blanking on his name, but his wife is just became a seminary head. Walren, Dr. Michael Walren in New York City.
Yes.
Who's extremely progressive and doesn't have any issues with LGBT stuff, and grew a mega church in New York City by simply getting rid of the issues of stigma. And so we have examples of a change starting to take place. But what's needed? How do we help foster the change? How do we keep the momentum going?
Well, I think the fundamentals of this is to really understand that the church is the community. And when we start blaming the church, it's like all the hurt and anger that we've ever experienced is because of the church, or we had a sexual violent experience with a pastor who was having his own issues. The church is a collection of just normal people. Straight people, gay people, transgender people, we are all in there on Sunday morning. People who rape somebody Saturday night, they're in church asking for Jesus' forgiveness. We don't know what's going on in people's hearts and minds. When they show up in church, we all come to church, saying, Lord, forgive us, and Lord, please continue to love us in all of our mess. And so, but we tend to put this light of we shine this light of perfection on the church, and then we say, y'all are not perfect. Well, the church is not perfect, and I work from the high holy. I work with all of them, and what I've found over these years in terms of moving the paradigm is that all of us are working on healing. And I really, really appreciate the work that you all are doing. And, I have as I sit here as an elder and watching each and every one of you take on this mantle, because in our community, we don't often take the time to pass the mantle along. And I'm feeling really good right now, just being a part of this conversation, just to see the next generation of health leaders, but in terms of moving, we have to get healed. And the leadership of the church is getting healed, and I think that we don't really give credit because we don't really see the healers. We see the folks who are still struggling. And the folks who are still struggling are the folks who are in the pulpit on Sunday morning, but where they are on Monday through Friday. You know what I mean? They're hooking up. You know what I mean? And it's not a good or bad thing. They just haven't come to terms on who they are or how they're going to function in their dual roles. We are all struggling with something, but we don't have grace. We don't have grace for people who are struggling outside of how we are struggling. That's our own internal stigma. And I wrote a book on Stand Up to Stigma, how to reject fear and shame, because our own individual shame keeps us in our own fear and stigma, and we then blame each other for your stigma. You know what I mean? Blame each, but we are all struggling with our stuff. So we find that as pastors and people of faith, because we're all people of faith. Let's get clear. We're not talking about those people of faith. We're all people of faith. As we people of faith get whole and heal and are able to step up and stand up and say, you know what? Hey, God loves everybody. You know what I mean? And even with the Balm and Gilead and that second verse, you know what I mean? Jesus came to die for all. You know what I mean? I stretch it out. When I'm singing it, I stretch it out. And I'm making a point that, Jesus died for everybody. He just didn't die for those of you who think you're holy. I have folks in my family. They declared, I am not going to heaven as far as they're concerned because I don't meet their requirements. Well, the good news is that I don't have to meet their requirements. You know what I mean? Because everybody in my life is going where I am. You know what I mean? Everybody got a place of grace. So because I'm in that place and I can stand up in my space and say that to the rafters. And I think that over these years, I've seen many, many leaders who have healed themselves, who have gotten in touch with where they have been, who they are today, and where they may be going, and they can bring people to task. And unfortunately, I don't have time to share stories with you, but I can think of a day, two pastors that you may know. One, W. Franklin Richardson up in New York. And I remember he had just, on that Saturday, he had spent the day with, our good Dr. Benny Prim and he had heard we were really immersing and talking about HIV in the Black gay community and women and all of that. And the next Sunday morning, he stood up and he said, listen, Grace, You know what I mean? If you are gay, and whatever you are, you got to take care of yourself. And he lifted up the brothers and sisters who were gay, particularly Black men who were gay. And this part of the congregation went, oh. And this part of the congregation says, hallelujah, Pastor, thank you. But that was a moment, because leaders, we have to support them in their standing up and bringing the congregation along. I also remember the Sunday when Reverend Dr. Calvin Butts had the HIV testing van outside of Abyssinian. And he was out taking the tests, and then he ran in church a little late and talked about how he just took the test. And the next Sunday, he had the van out and he got his results. And the next Sunday he ran in and he talked to his wife, and he was like, sister, I can't call her name, but he brought the whole congregation into the conversation around. One Sunday he was getting the test. The next Sunday he got the results, and he brought his wife in to say, and she said, you'd better be negative. They had a fun thing with it, but it was a very serious moment. So we have to support leaders who have to bring the congregation along. Just like we who have been in the struggle for generations, post-traumatic stress. You know what I mean? We in this for 400 years. You know what I mean? And we are dealing with post-traumatic stress individually as well as collectively, and it doesn't happen overnight. When we are hurting, we want our pain to go away right away. But I'm telling you, my brothers and sisters, pain don't go away overnight, and we have to keep at it. I do want to say, I want to bring it back to HIV and COVID, HIV and Alzheimer's. That's another major health disparity in our community. HIV and diabetes, another epidemic. HIV and cancer. So when we're talking about, now that we are way up the road, decades of HIV, we have people who are living longer. And now we have to address, the Balm and Gilead in our brain health center. We have to talk about HIV and Alzheimer's, because we have HIV positive individuals who now have what? Alzheimer's. When we're talking about diabetes, we have a major diabetes program. And guess what? They also have HIV. And the health disparities around cancer. And they also have HIV. So it's like we have to really, understand that this is so much, this is a human condition. You know what I mean? We can't no longer just talk about HIV. As we grow older, we're talking about HIV and COVID, HIV and lung cancer, HIV and diabetes. So how do we broaden the conversation to be inclusive of everybody? And then we're dealing with our own traumatic stress, because I don't know whether it's post or not. I think it's right now.
Yes, it's current traumatic slavery disorder. Is what we're dealing with. And I want to shift gears slightly. Again, this is a National HIV Testing Day event. And so the theme this year for National HIV Testing Day is knowing your status, knowing your options, knowing prevention. It's all about knowledge and knowing. And so the question I have is that, I will say that, I love my people, but we have some magical thinking at times, and we have to acknowledge that. And what I mean by magical thinking is, I remember going out with some of my staff when I was director of HIV for Fulton County, Georgia, and I went out with my staff to do outreach around PrEP. And we were talking to a group of women, talking to them about Black women, talking to them about PrEP. And it's one pill once a day. And the reaction was, oh no, I ain't taking that, because if I take it, it's probably going to give me HIV. This kind of magic, and that was not the first time I had heard that I've heard that from gay men and Black people, period. And some of it is just due to the fact that medical systems have treated Black bodies so horribly, and I want somebody to talk about that. But let's also talk about the fact that, there comes a time when, if the theme of HIV Testing Day is knowledge, particularly with a president in office who doesn't care about facts, and we have a people who are already predisposed to distrust the knowledge they've been given them because they've already been given some twisted knowledge in the past. How do you get knowledge about COVID? Because again, we talked about before, the knowledge we had was COVID doesn't affect Black people. If I take PrEP, it's going to give me HIV. How do we really have conversations where we can transmit knowledge? Because I was talking to a group of preachers once and got almost into an argument with a young woman, a female pastor, who was just adamant that I was trying to give everybody HIV by giving them a pill that wasn't going to work. And because I'm with the government and I'm trying to kill everybody that's Black. So
right.
Come on and talk about that.
Absolutely. And so one, I think that again, when you talk about moments where people are like make you sound crazy, COVID makes you realize that you're not crazy, because you see from a very clear perspective that there is misinformation being shared. There's so many things that have happened that if you mentioned this 10 years, 20 years ago, people would just write you off. And so in this conversation, there needs to be one, an accountability, not just to Black people, but also systems that are designed to serve Black people. And so one, there has to be an understanding that we're not just talking about Tuskegee, we're talking about Baltimore, we're talking about what happened when Black people were used as medical experiments, and again, how the trauma of that manifests in this moment. So as we talk about the different things around the science of HIV, we have to also talk about the reality of HIV as well. So when we're talking about PrEP, it's good that people get yes, it's one pill once a day. That's great. That's what the science says. But it's around now, how do you start creating initiatives and particularly from a funding initiative for organizations that are serving Black communities to be able to find and harness those positive conversations. But I think that so often we really stay at a very surface level around these conversations, thinking and systems thinking that that we're in a space of equity when we are not. So there needs to be a deeper dive into having those conversations about stigma, about having those conversations about points of wellness, and also having conversations within the medical provider system about how previous trauma to Black people play out in what's happening now. What the research continues to show is that there's not only an issue with talking about Black people and certain communities of Black communities within the community itself, it's within the provider community as well. And there are a number of stories that talk about providers not being comfortable in talking to Black people, particularly those of trans experience, about their sex life, about what they need, and really to be able to really determine and set these standards of care. So I think that is a conversation we have to really move into, because I think that sometimes we try to put too much on the community versus those who are funded, who are made to support our health systems, our government, to in place to be able to do that. And I'll pause right there. I have a few more things, but I don't want to take too much time. Quick.
I want to jump to Ian for a second, because in keeping in that same vein, I'm reminded of a conversation had with a white brother some years ago at a church I was at, and we were talking about he was a scientist of some kind, and we were talking about just Black people. Many Black people will tell you that HIV came because the government created it to kill Black people. That's what many Black people will say. And so he's a scientist, and he was going on and on about how this is scientifically impossible, that, Black people are paranoid. I don't know why Black people are paranoid, and so on and so forth. And you need to tell you're in the field, you know better, and blah, 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 blah. And I turned to him when he said, you know better. And I turned to him and I said, I know I'm in the field, but I don't know better. And he said, well, how could you not know better? You understand that? I said, I understand the science of it very clearly. I said, but my experience of HIV is mediated by my experience of being Black first. And my experience of being Black says that this government can do some interesting things to people that it doesn't like.
Mm-hmm.
So your experience has been that the government is always on your side. That's never been my experience, that the government is always on my side and always looking out for me. And so, Ian, talk a little bit about how, again, as Benton was talking about, this Black paranoia, especially as it relates to HIV, what are some of the undercurrents of it? What are some of the roots of it? And how do we, because we still do have to address a knowledge gap with HIV and a knowledge gap with COVID. How do we do that to especially the younger people who, again, with the current president that we have, has taught young people, don't trust nothing nobody says?
So I just want to make the narrative clear, right? So we're asking people who generally have been kicked out. 40% of LGBT. 40% of homeless youth are LGBT, right? So they've been kicked out their homes. They've been kicked out the churches, right? And the only space that they have is kind of like the club, going back to the original narrative, right? As persons of color, specifically Black queer people, right? And so then all of a sudden we have these organizations, generally white-led, generally white-driven, generally focused on moving towards the FQHC model, which obviously is about the 340B dollars, right? And those organizations say, come to us because we love you. We have this magical pill that we want you to take. All you have to do is come see us a certain amount of times throughout the year, and you are going to keep yourself from getting HIV. Aside from what we know from history, it just does not make sense. Why are you being so nice to me, right? Why are you now trying to cultivate a relationship with me to get on this quote unquote magical pill in order to keep me from getting HIV? Especially when you didn't talk about my homelessness. Especially when you didn't talk about my familial relationships, right? Especially when you didn't talk about the fact that I am having to do things like sex work or do things like studies just in order for me to eat, right? And you really want me to believe that you're really doing this from a really authentic and sincere place. And so I think that it's really going to take conversations with these larger, mostly white-led organizations around what does it look like. I saw Yadira in the comments talk about trauma-informed care. What does it mean to have a trauma-informed approach to providing medical things, right? What does it look like from a healing justice lens to actually move the needle forward as it relates to things like PrEP? Because the reality is, for me, I sit in a very privileged standpoint where PrEP is an additive to my life, right? Because I may or may not have condomless sex like most people, right? PrEP is an additive to my life. But if I had to work, which was 5 years ago, if I had to still worry about homelessness, if I still had to worry about the fact that I had to have sex with somebody in order to get a meal, if I still had to worry about, this is my story, so I know hundreds of stories just like this, right? If I still had to worry about that, couldn't nobody tell me that just come on into the clinic 2 times every 3 months in order to get this magical pill to stop HIV. Child, I got to worry about police and living and life, right? So I think the conversation needs to be, what does this trauma-informed approach look like? Also, Vinton speaks about this. I'm surprised I haven't heard about it today, but it might be in his notes. But it's really important for people that look like us to be in spaces of power, right? And we have to have that conversation, right? We have to have a conversation about what does it look like to come into organizations to get things done for me where no one looks like me, where no one understands me, where no one sits at my intersections, right? And so what do those conversations look like? Because it's not just the explicit bias, it's the I didn't even know that I was giving this bias, right, to you because I don't understand your experience. So it's all of those, it's a multiplicity of things, but those are the main things that I think that we need to have a conversation about regarding giving care to especially younger people, because we really need to know that it's from an authentic place and that you understand that there are multiple needs that I need to have accomplished in order to have wholeness.
Yes.
I want to read a couple of comments and then I'm going to go jump right back into that. But I have Sadie, and I don't want to butcher your last name, but Sadie, you know who you are. You wrote, sometimes we have to stick to main message to support everyone. Our messages sometimes change because one organization wants to be better than the other. That's how the messages change. And then we have Marcus Weiss. Good to see you, Marcus. He wrote, I have heard many accounts of Black people feeling ignored, stigmatized, anxious, afraid, and talked down to during medical visits. These incidences definitely highlight the need for trauma-informed care and cultural competence in the delivery of HIV service. And I absolutely agree with that. And so I want to stick on that vein that you just ended on, Ian, and I want to talk with Shiloh and Dr. Steele about this. So if you have a breast cancer organization, 9 times out of 10, 9.5 times out of 10, the leadership is primarily female, because that's who is primarily impacted by breast cancer. HIV primarily impacts Black people and Black gay men in particular. But if we look at our organizations, if we look at our health departments, the places and spaces that come to, where people come to for help, very often that people, you will not see someone who looks like you, even though you're most at risk for HIV. And so, Vinton, I know you have a lot to say about this as well. So for any of you three, what is going on in our industry? Because we would, if there was a breast cancer organization that was 100% male, people would lose their minds, just lose it. But yet and still, we have HIV organizations that are 100% white in terms of their leadership. And we don't say nothing about that. And we just go, well, okay, that's just the way it is. So how do we change our health departments? And I know it's difficult sometimes in a health department context, but how do we speak to our health departments and our organizations around this issue of equity and parity when it comes to leadership of organizations? Oh, it's quiet in Zion.
No, I was just pausing, but I can go.
I'm going to give my little simple line and then pitch it to Vincent, because I see all of it going off in his brain. So I think what larger organizations are doing now is they've learned the trick of what we'll do is we'll put the face, we'll put the Black face, the brown face, the served face that needs to be there, and we'll allow them to do the community work, or we'll allow them to be the boots on the street where it is, but they can't come back and talk about the truths of what the community is speaking about. And so until those things two mesh, and until the person who's the boots on the street then becomes the boss, or then becomes the executive or the executor, there won't be any, that dial won't move forward. And but the trick has continued to be that these decisions will be made in closed doors, but as long as this information is trickled down and it's being put forth by a brown or Black face, then they have to believe them. And we just give the script. But I will say the great thing about people who are working in the community, who are community minded, know how to talk to people of community, and know that it's not just having a conversation, it's building a relationship. And it's all about getting into the community and understanding what the issues is, just like Ian talked about, what the issues are before we address something that has to deal with something that would make my organization feel better. But the sad thing is that person who does all that wonderful work doesn't necessarily get a chance to see that upward level mobility in organizations that you talk about. Take it home, Vincent.
Well, one question I want to come back to, but I'm going to start with the conversation about leadership is, I think we have to really talk about the history of sex and socialization and really what does that mean in public health messaging. But coming back to the leadership conversation, I think that what I've seen in my time in the field, we always, and I say we, I'm talking about the field, want to hear the stories, the disclosure stories, the pain, the trauma. Like people want to fly you out somewhere and get you on stage to just bleed your trauma out. As a young, like how many times as a when I was a young Black gay man that I was asked to come on stage and disclose and just tell my story. Unfortunately, we don't invest in the development of our, of the communities that we want to be at the table. And I think that that is a huge disadvantage in this field. And I think that, when these, organizations start, getting on in their newsletters and their stages at these conferences to, pontificate about the value of Black lives, what my response is, you have to protect the Black lives in your organization before you start talking about the Black lives in society. And oftentimes, in these organizations, they do not protect and invest in the Black lives of their organization. So it's almost hypocritical to hear them say in other spaces how much Black lives matter. And that is a chief complaint that I have, in the HIV field about how we don't do that necessary work of investing in our community. So if the chief complaint is we don't have Black people trained to be in these public health spaces, what are the programs and funding opportunities that you're using to invest in that kind of leadership, to build their ability to manage projects, to run organizations, to be able to operate at C-suite levels? That's the work that's not being done in the work. And if you have the privilege of coming from another industry into HIV work, already trained and ready to go, you might have a chance. But if you, like a number of young people who are brought into this work in their 19, 20, 21, and put on these stages and continuously put on these stages, and they wake up one day and they're 30 years old and they haven't been invested in, and then we try to put them in an organization now running an initiative, they're not going to be successful. And the organizations that say that they're there for those conversations, they're not there in those conversations. So I think that that's an important piece that we have to put back into this movement, is that investing in that leadership, so you don't just have people coming to your organizations and operating for free, that you're actually contributing to their long-term investment in this work.
Cool. So we got to get ready to wrap up. And I have a couple of comments I want to read and some questions. And anybody else that's tuning in, if you have questions, please put them in the box. We're going to go rapid fire with some questions real quick. First, I want to take from Angelique McClure. She writes, Shiloh looks amazing. I agree with her on that. You look amazing. Morris Singletary, he wrote, I agree about the equity of having the us match us in the clinics and in the boards and panels. How do those of us who came from another field in life get the educational needs that are wanted by the organizations? Anybody want to do a rapid fire answer to that? It's quiet in Zion again.
I want to, if I can just speak to, just make as we wrap up, I want to say, I don't want to lose the point that Black folks all over the world, we fundamentally believe that white people are trying to kill us. And that's not a joke.
That's the truth.
I have been blessed to go around the world several times. And Black people all over the world, we fundamentally believe that white people are trying to kill us. And because we feel powerless against that, we put our power in a Jesus or Muhammad. So therefore, I don't have to take the drug. Therefore, there are things I don't have to do because my power has been transferred to something that can beat this thing that is trying to get me. So, but I'm not going to spend no more time on that. I think that and I know I got to wrap up here. I think that it's very important that we the Black folks continue to come together, and I see organizations working together like Black folks used to do. And because once again, I'm putting my elder hat on again, is that we were able to make, I'm thinking about the minority, one of the legislative branches, where so we had Balm and Gilead, and we had Black Leadership Commission on AIDS, and we had Black AIDS Institute, and we had Bishop Yvette Flunder, and all of us were working together. We had our own thing, but we were all able to work together, and we would come up on either whether it was a Friday night or a Sunday, or whether we were in a hotel, you know what I mean? We might be in the bar that night, but we were going to shut CDC down the next morning. You know what I mean? We were going to write legislation. And even though we were at the beauty parlor, and I could think of Deborah Fraser House and all of us in the beauty parlor, and we were writing legislation. So we didn't agree, but we found ways to agree. And we also knew who could talk best to who. You know what I mean? Who could talk best to the politicians? Who could best talk best to the faith community? Who could talk best to the Black, gay, transgender community? We weren't in competition with each other. We had our own thing, but we were able to come together in the middle of the night and say who was best to lead this conversation or do this conversation. So we had our own little light, but we had a bigger light when we worked together, even though when we didn't agree, when we came out, we were one force. And I think that was so important, for the first phase of the movement. That is, if I can say anything, leaving this conversation, is that we the Black folks, we know how to talk to Black people. We know what our issues are, and we have to have people who are inside white institutions at the table when we're coming together talking about how do we change the system. Black folks internally got to change the system. White folks are not going to change the system for us. Things are changing now because Black people in the streets, that's how it changed in the 60s. That's how it's changing now. And it was Black folks in these institutions that must change the institution once again. So I'm going to be quiet.
Okay. Thank you. All right, we got to wrap up. I need everybody to give me your 45-second elevator pitch on the importance of HIV testing and Black people getting an HIV test. You got 45 seconds, beginning with Dr. Shiloh Fields.
I'll take it. I know that the theme is knowing, but there is so much more to just knowing. I want to go back to the motto of know, manage, and live. Once you know your status, you get a chance to manage exactly what to do with that status, be it biomedical things or be it just continuing to use condoms, and then you'll know how to live a better life for yourself. But you got to know first. So know, manage, and live your life and do it beautifully.
Great. Ian Haddock, 45-second elevator pitch.
Knowing your status is activism. We're talking about Black Lives Matter. I think it's important to look at it in that context because knowing your status allows you to be responsible over your body and responsible to the communities in which you live in. So definitely know your status because your life matters.
Venton Hill Jones.
All right. So there's a couple things for testing day. One, we have to really be able to understand our history and understand how the history of these services have manifested for Black people. We have to make sure that we're having conversations about sex and sexuality. And I think that this conversation around knowing is not just about knowing your status, but it's also knowing communities that you're serving and also knowing real solutions for making sure that these things can work, because we know the science says that, if you get tested, you'll find out your status. If you get on treatment, you can become undetectable. But there's a lot of things that's in the nuance that we need to now explore. And that's a conversation, as Dr. Seal said, that we have to now continue bring back to the point of doing that together and really not being afraid, just like they do in the streets. If things are not working for Black people, shut it down.
Finally, Dr. Seal, 45-second elevator pitch. You're muted. There we go.
If you believe that Black lives matter, then know that your life matter. If you believe that Black lives matter and you're Black, then your life matter. Know your status, go get tested, take your treatment, manage your situation. If you believe Black lives matter, then your life matter, and act upon it.
I want to close with a couple of comments from people. Kurt Barber wrote, I believe that you can have all the conferences and speaking engagements you want, but until people get out there and do the work to help stop and prevent the spread of HIV, there has not been people out there in the field doing outreach and safer sex education. So we need to get out into the streets and turn it up. And finally, Tanya Bender-Henderson just quoted, "Knowing your status is activism." That is, and she wrote, bravo to that. Again, I'm Derek Wilson, Executive Director of Southern AIDS Coalition. You can find us at southernaidscoalition.org on the internet. I want to thank all of those who were on this panel. It was an incredible time of conversation and sharing. Hopefully we can get the band back together someday soon and continue the conversation. Until then, thank you very much. Carrie Goodman, thank you very much for your work in putting this together. Kwame, thank you for your work. Daphina Ward, thank you for your work, and for all of those who made this possible. I do appreciate what you've done. Please, June 27th is International HIV Testing Day. If you haven't been tested in the past 12 months, this is a good reminder for you to get a test. Until then, be blessed and be healthy. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.